From the earliest times, for tens of thousands of years, humans have sought to rule, and those who once gained power rarely wish to part with it. Human history, spanning periods from primitive communities to modern states, is filled with countless examples of rulers, from tribal chieftains and ancient kings to emperors and modern leaders, using a variety of methods to maintain their positions. Some of these methods were obvious: brute force, a powerful army, harsh laws, public exemplary punishments, the construction of impregnable fortresses, and demonstrations of military superiority. These tactics were visible and served as direct intimidation. However, there were and are other, much more subtle, almost invisible tricks that worked unnoticed, penetrating deep into people's minds and hearts, shaping their worldview, beliefs, and even self-identification. These tricks did not require overt violence or direct threats, but their effectiveness was no less, and often exceeded brute force in the long term. They allowed rulers to remain at the top of the power pyramid, often convincing the people that this was their natural, inevitable, or even divine destiny. These clever strategies worked so covertly that subjects rarely realized they were being manipulated, accepting the imposed ideas as their own or as immutable truths. Such methods did not disappear in the past with the fall of empires or the change of political systems. They simply transformed, adapted to new realities and technologies, and continue to shape political landscapes in our time. Their tenacity demonstrates the universality of human psychology and the unchanging desire for control. Their invisibility consisted not only in the absence of a public declaration, but also in the fact that they were not part of official doctrine or open, aggressive propaganda. On the contrary, they were subtly integrated into everyday life, culture, the educational system, mass entertainment, becoming part of the self-evident, of what seemed to be the natural order of things. Understanding these mechanisms allows us to look deeper into the nature of power, at how it manipulates public consciousness, forcing millions of people to accept certain orders as a given, even if they do not always correspond to their own interests or common sense. Today we will take a detailed look at 6 such cunning strategies that have helped and continue to help those in power to hold on to the reins of power, often unnoticed by the vast majority of the population. These tricks are the art of managing perception, creating invisible shackles that are stronger than any material chains. They touch the deepest strings of human nature: faith, fear, the need for security, the desire for participation, and the need to survive. One of the most powerful, ancient, and fundamental tricks that allowed rulers to retain power for thousands of years was to implant in the minds of the people the idea that the ruler himself was something special, exceptional, endowed with either supernatural powers or direct divine blessing, or exceptional, unattainable wisdom and insight. This strategy effectively deprived the subjects of even the thought of resistance, since to oppose such a leader would mean going against fate itself, against the will of higher powers, gods or nature itself, which for most religious people was unthinkable and perceived as sacrilege, promising terrible punishment. In ancient Egypt, for example, the pharaohs were considered not just rulers, but living gods, incarnations of Horus, the god of the sky and kingship. Their words were absolute law, their will sacred and unquestionable. Every aspect of their lives, from their birth to their majestic death and burial, was shrouded in complex rituals, ceremonies, and myths that continually supported and reinforced their divine status. The great pyramids and monumental temples erected in their honor were not simply tombs or places of worship. They were permanent, tangible, and undeniable physical evidence of their unearthly power and majesty. These colossal structures were overwhelming in their scale, making people feel small and insignificant in the face of the might of a ruler whose power extended beyond human understanding, encompassing both the earthly and divine worlds. Cult practices, daily religious rites, lavish festivals, and countless hieroglyphic inscriptions glorifying the pharaohs were part of a comprehensive system that reinforced this myth around the clock and everywhere. The people believed that the prosperity of the country, the fertile Nile, bountiful harvests, successful military campaigns, and general well-being were directly dependent on the pharaoh's favor and his unbreakable connection with the gods. Thus, any attempt, even the slightest, to overthrow him or to show disobedience was perceived as an act threatening the very existence of the world, order and well-being of the whole society. It was a powerful psychological trap that kept the masses in submission. In the Roman Empire, although emperors were not always considered living gods in the same direct way as the Egyptian pharaohs, the cult of the emperor was a powerful instrument of control and legitimization. Many were formally deified after death, and during their lifetime they bore titles such as Augustus, which is Latin for majestic, sacred, or exalted. Emperors also held the office of Pontifex Maximus, the head of the state religion, which gave their political power a strong religious overtone and made their decisions seem sanctified. The use of grand triumphs, in which the victorious general and later the emperor himself rode into Rome on a chariot, was seen as an undeniable confirmation of their special favor with the gods. All imperial propaganda, skillfully embodied in numerous sculptures, coins, architectural structures, inscriptions, and literary works, depicted the emperor as an ideal ruler, a wise commander, a caring father of the fatherland, the chosen one of the gods, the guarantor of peace and prosperity. This created a powerful psychological barrier against any dissent or insubordination. After all, to oppose such a leader who was associated with the greatness and success of Rome would mean going against the will of heaven, against the fate of the eternal city itself. And even if individual citizens did not believe in the direct kinship of the emperor with the gods, the very idea that he was chosen or blessed by higher powers created a powerful foundation for his undeniable power. In medieval Europe, this ploy took its specific form through the doctrine of, by the grace of God, the king, Dei gratia rex. This concept, actively supported and disseminated by the powerful church, claimed that the monarch received his authority directly from God, not from the people or any earthly institutions. Consequently, his rule was considered sacred and not subject to human laws. The king was not just a secular ruler, but God's representative on earth, his anointed one. Any attempt on his authority, rebellion, or even open criticism of his actions was considered a grave sin against God, for which both earthly and heavenly punishment would follow. Coronations were lavish and majestic religious ceremonies that emphasized the divine nature of the monarch's power. Royal regalia, the crown, scepter, orb, were perceived not just as symbols, but as sacred objects endowed with special divine power. Legends spread about miraculous healings performed by kings, for example, the famous royal touch in France and England, when it was believed that the monarch's touch could cure scrofula, which further strengthened the belief in their special connection with higher powers. Hola! This myth was so deeply rooted in the popular consciousness that even when monarchs displayed tyranny, incompetence, or cruelty, the people often attributed it to God's test, punishment for the sins of the entire nation, or inscrutable providence, rather than to the weakness or wickedness of the ruler himself. This interpretation allowed them to maintain faith in the legitimacy of power, even in the most difficult times. In the 20th century, with the gradual decline of traditional religiosity and the rise of mass ideologies, this ploy was transformed into a total personality cult. Leaders of totalitarian regimes such as Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, Mao Zedong in China, Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany, or Kim Il-sung in North Korea were elevated to the rank of infallible, all-knowing, all-powerful, and absolutely brilliant leaders. Their images literally filled all public space. Giant portraits hung in every home, every school, every square, every institution. Their quotes were required to be studied and followed without question. Their biographies were glorified, often with the addition of fictitious heroic episodes. The propaganda machine tirelessly created myths about their incredible abilities, wisdom, and foresight, presenting them as the only saviors of the nation, capable of leading it to a bright future. Children from a very early age in schools and pioneer organizations learned to love, worship, and unquestioningly obey the leader. Any doubt about their genius, critical attitude to their decisions, or attempt to question their authority was considered a grave crime, undermining the foundations of the state and deserving severe punishment. Leaders often attributed to themselves successes achieved at the cost of enormous human sacrifices, for example, collectivization or industrialization, or even natural phenomena, for example, favorable weather, presenting them as a direct result of their wise leadership. This cult replaced traditional religion, creating a new all-encompassing system of beliefs in which the leader became the central object of worship, the source of truth and grace. In North Korea, for example, the mythology surrounding the Kim family includes fantastic stories of miracles associated with their birth and activities, creating the image of truly divine rulers whose dynasty is predetermined by fate and is eternal. This trick is incredibly powerful because it does not simply demand obedience out of fear. It creates a deep, sincere, often fanatical faith in the ruler, making him untouchable in the eyes of the vast majority of the population. People voluntarily become adepts of his cult, and critical thinking is suppressed at the very level of its possibility. The second was information control and the creation of the only true picture of the world. Control over information flows is not just an act of censorship, but a complex multi-level system of shaping public consciousness, allowing rulers to create and maintain a picture of the world that is beneficial to their power. From ancient times to the present day, leaders have understood that the thoughts and beliefs of the people can be effectively directed if they strictly control what they see, hear, read, and discuss. If the people receive only the information that is consistent with the official line, then their worldview is formed in the right direction, and doubts, critical thoughts, and, as a consequence, any organized resistance simply do not arise or are quickly suppressed. In societies where literacy was rare and access to written sources was limited, oral tradition, myths, legends, and religious texts became the main sources of information. This is why the priesthood, under the control of the ruler or closely associated with him, played a key role in shaping public opinion. They interpreted natural phenomena, droughts, floods, earthquakes, explained military failures as the wrath of the gods or divine tests, and successes as blessings and signs of favor from above, always in a way that was advantageous to the ruling elite. Chroniclers, scribes, and court historians carefully selected events to record, rewriting and reinterpreting the past in such a way that it served to legitimize the existing power and create a heroic image of the ruler. Inconvenient facts, mistakes, or failures of the ruler were simply ignored, minimized, or distorted. For example, military defeats could be presented as temporary tactical retreats and minor skirmishes as great victories. With the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, and then with the development of mass printing of newspapers, pamphlets, and books, the task of controlling information became much more difficult. But the possibilities for manipulating society also increased many times over. Governments quickly realized the enormous potential of this tool and began to establish strict censorship, issue special licenses for printing houses, and strictly control the content of all printed materials. In the 17th and 18th centuries, most countries in Europe had state censorship that did not allow the publication of any materials critical of the monarchy, aristocracy, or the official church. Violations of these rules were followed by severe penalties, including imprisonment and execution. But the real heyday of this ploy occurred in the 20th century, with the advent and widespread use of mass media, radio, film, and later television. Totalitarian regimes such as Nazi Germany under Joseph Goebbels, the Soviet Union under its propaganda department, or China under Mao Zedong built propaganda machines of unprecedented scale and effectiveness. Radios were a must in every home, but they could only be tuned to state stations. Newspapers printed only approved material, often in huge multi-million print runs, which were distributed forcibly. Newsreels and feature films created idealized images of life in the country, showing the successes of building a new society and tirelessly demonizing external enemies or internal traitors. History textbooks were rewritten many times, sometimes 10 or 20 times over several decades, to perfectly match the current ideological line, creating an absolutely false but completely uniform picture of the past. Children were taught from a very early age in schools and youth organizations the correct understanding of history, politics, and current events. Any deviation from the official line of behavior or thinking was persecuted, and people who spread incorrect information or expressed dissent were labeled enemies of the people, saboteurs, or spies, and were subjected to brutal repression, including imprisonment, exile, and execution. In such conditions, citizens simply had no access to alternative sources of information. They lived in a complete information bubble, where absolutely everything they heard, saw, and read continuously confirmed the official version of reality. This led to many people sincerely, with deep conviction, believing in propaganda. Since they had no objective grounds to doubt it, Not just a system of prohibitions and punishments was created, but a whole system of rewards for correct thoughts and words, which formed a deep self-censorship. People were afraid to even think about something that could be regarded as dissent, not to mention saying it out loud. With the advent of the internet and the rise of social media in the 21st century, the task of controlling information became more difficult for governments due to the decentralized and global nature of the web. However, rulers quickly adapted, developing new and sophisticated methods. The creation of thousands of fake accounts that massively disseminate desired information, silence criticism, discredit opponents, attack independent media, and create the illusion of broad public support for government decisions. Often used not to combat real disinformation, but to suppress any information that does not correspond to the official agenda or criticizes the government, under the pretext of protecting against lies or preventing panic. All of these methods are aimed at disorienting the population and convincing them that there is no objective truth other than that which comes from the authorities. If people cannot trust any information other than official information, they become extremely vulnerable to manipulation and incapable of critical analysis. This trick works in the long term, forming entire generations whose worldview is completely in line with the interests of the ruling elite, making them voluntary or unconscious supporters of the existing order and preventing them from realizing the true state of affairs. The third was the principle of divide and rule. This is one of the most cynical but incredibly effective strategies for maintaining power, which has proven its viability over thousands of years of human history. Its essence is not in direct suppression, but in preventing potential opponents from uniting against the ruler, instead skillfully forcing them to fight and feud with each other. When a society is fragmented into small warring groups, it simply has neither the strength, nor the attention, nor the resources to recognize its common oppressor and organize effective resistance to the central government. The government, in turn, can act as a peacemaker or arbitrator, strengthening its authority by intervening in conflicts that it itself may have provoked or fanned. The Roman Empire, which ruled over vast territories with an extremely diverse population that included dozens of nations, tribes, and cultures, was a master of this ploy. Rather than seeking to forcibly assimilate all conquered peoples into a single Roman culture, they often supported and even cultivated differences between them. For example, some tribes or cities might be granted certain privileges, tax exemptions, or limited self-government, while others, geographically close or ethnically related, were denied such privileges or subjected to more stringent controls. This created tension, jealousy, and rivalry among neighbors, causing them to compete with one another for Rome's favor instead of uniting. Rome's authority acted as a supreme, unquestionable arbiter to whom internal disputes and conflicts were addressed, thereby further strengthening its unquestioned authority. When intertribal or urban conflicts arose within the provinces, Rome often tactically supported one side, ultimately weakening both and preventing the formation of any united front against itself. Moreover, it was to Rome's advantage to have conquered peoples occasionally fight each other, since this reduced their numbers, weakened their military potential, and distracted them from their desire for independence. In the Middle Ages and early modern period, European rulers often used religious, class, or clan differences to pit their subjects against each other. Religious wars such as the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, as well as mass persecutions of heretics, such as the Albigensians or Hussites, and witches, were often used to distract the population from economic problems caused by famine, epidemics, or excessive taxes, as well as political discontent. If the people had a clearly defined scapegoat, heretics, Jews, pagans, witches, on whom all troubles, crop failures, diseases, plague, high taxes, natural disasters, could be blamed, then anger and indignation were not directed against the ruler or the nobility. The ruler could even initiate or encourage pogroms, inquisition trials, or mass expulsions in order to channel the people's discontent into a safe channel, simultaneously confiscating the property of the victims and replenishing the treasury. The creation of various privileged classes, nobility, clergy, and their rigid opposition to the rest of the population, peasants, townspeople, artisans, also contributed to the deep division of society. Each class had its own specific interests, often contradicting the interests of others, which prevented them from uniting into a single force. This system ensured that potential allies remained implacable enemies, constantly weakening each other. The 19th and 20th centuries brought new, more sophisticated forms of this ploy, especially with the rise of nationalism, class movements, and new ideologies. Rulers became adept at fomenting ethnic hatred or class struggle to their advantage. For example, in the vast colonial empires, British, French, Belgian, colonial powers often used a policy of division, giving some ethnic or religious groups, e.g., Sikhs in India, Tutsis in Rwanda, more power, education, or privileges than others, in order to prevent the formation of a unified national liberation movement. This led to long-term conflicts that flared up decades after the colonizers left. Class struggle could also be artificially inflamed or, on the contrary, suppressed, depending on the current political advantage of the ruling elite. The division into us and them became the basis for many repressive regimes. In the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, this trick was carried to an extreme, inhuman degree. A permanent image of an enemy of the people within the country was created and maintained. This could be Trotskyists, murderous doctors, kulaks, bourgeois elements, cosmopolitans, spies and saboteurs, nationalists, saboteurs, or any other category of citizens who were conveniently blamed for all the problems and failures of the country. Propaganda tirelessly demonized these groups, presenting them as a mortal threat to the entire society, to its existence and well-being. A widespread system of denunciations was introduced, where every citizen was actively encouraged to inform on neighbors, co-workers, classmates, or even members of their own family if they showed the slightest signs of dissent or unreliability. This created an atmosphere of total mistrust, suspicion, and paralyzing fear. People were afraid to speak out, to criticize the government, or even to communicate with those who could potentially be classified as unreliable elements. Society was transformed into an atomized, disparate mass of individuals, each of whom felt lonely and vulnerable, feared each other, and all without exception feared the all-powerful, omnipresent government. In such an atmosphere, any organized resistance or opposition became virtually impossible. In the modern world, with the development of information technology and mass communications, the divide and rule trick is acquiring new, often even more subtle and elusive forms. For example, strengthening and aggravating disagreements between supporters of different political parties or ideologies, bringing these disagreements to the level of irreconcilable, often irrational, hostility. An atmosphere is created where compromise is impossible, and the opponent is perceived not just as a dissenter, but as an enemy, setting different cultural, social, gender, religious, or age groups against each other on issues of identity, values, lifestyle, historical memory. These conflicts, often initially natural for a pluralistic society, are artificially inflated and used to distract attention. The goal of all these maneuvers is always the same: to distract the people from the real problems and the real source of power, forcing them to focus on fighting each other, whether for identity, resources, or moral values. When people are busy with mutual accusations, hatred, and struggle, they do not ask uncomfortable questions of the government, do not demand accountability, and do not see the real reasons for their difficulties. This allows the ruler to act as a stabilizer, a national unifier, or a savior who is ostensibly trying to reconcile warring factions, even though he may be the secret architect of that division, covertly or overtly fueling the conflict. This ploy, though delicately calculated, is incredibly powerful, as it exploits a society's internal contradictions to weaken it and strengthen external power. Another incredibly clever and subtle trick by which rulers have successfully maintained and strengthened their power is to create the illusion in their subjects that they have some influence on decisions, or that their opinions are actively taken into account when forming state policy. This is not real power or real participation, but only a skillfully created appearance of it, which, however, significantly reduces the level of discontent in society, channels potential protests into a safe channel, and prevents open rebellion. This trick is based on the deep human need to feel part of something bigger, to have a voice and influence, even if in reality it is not there. In ancient times and in medieval societies, these could be formal meetings of elders, people's assemblies, or noble diets, where the most important decisions were already predetermined by the ruler or a narrow elite. But the very fact of their discussion and coordination created a sense of involvement in the decision-making process among certain segments of the population. Rulers might occasionally hold public hearings or allow citizens to submit petitions, knowing in advance that the vast majority of them would either be ignored or considered only formally. However, the very process of submitting and considering such petitions calmed the population, creating the illusion of fairness and the ruler's accessibility. It was a kind of letting off steam for discontent, which, instead of developing into a riot, remained within the framework of permitted procedures. In more modern times, especially since the 19th and 20th centuries, much more sophisticated and extensive forms of this trick have appeared, which are still actively used today. One of the most common examples is elections without real choice. Citizens are formally invited to vote and elect their representatives or the ruler himself. But in reality, either all candidates represent the same ruling party or coalition, or the real opposition is not allowed to participate in the elections. It is denied registration, administrative resources are used to hinder it, criminal cases are fabricated against the leaders, or the results are predetermined and falsified through various mechanisms. People go to the polling stations, cast ballots, feel like active participants in the political process and full citizens. But in reality, their vote has no real impact on the outcome or the political course of the country. This creates a convincing appearance of democracy and legitimacy of power, both in the eyes of their own people and before the international community. People thus feel that their will has been expressed, and if something goes wrong, they blame not the system or the ruler, but the wrong choice of the people, the machinations of enemies, or objective circumstances, and not the government itself, which is not really accountable to them. Another example is the creation of numerous public councils, popular fronts, consultative committees, or pseudo-public organizations, which are formally called upon to represent the interests of citizens and interact with the authorities, but in fact are completely controlled by the ruling regime. These organizations can hold meetings, organize actions, always approved from above, publish statements, and even criticize individual minor shortcomings, often agreed upon in advance. However, their actions always strictly correspond to the interests of the ruling regime, and they never pose a real threat to the authorities. These pocket organizations serve as a buffer between the people and the government, channeling popular discontent into a safe, manageable channel and creating a constant semblance of dialogue between society and the government. People are given the opportunity to speak out, but only within strictly defined limits and on predetermined topics. Their criticism or suggestions can even be used to identify potential opponents or to create the appearance of working on mistakes and increasing efficiency, although no real systemic changes occur that could undermine the foundations of power. Public debates on bills that have in fact long been approved or are being prepared for approval without taking into account the opinion of the population, or so-called direct lines with the ruler, where questions are carefully selected and filtered, and the ruler himself pronounces prepared answers, are also part of this trick. They create the illusion of openness, accountability, and direct interaction between the leader and the people, but in fact, they are a carefully planned, controlled performance. The goal is not to hear the real problems of citizens or change the political course, but to give people the opportunity to let off steam, feel that their voice is heard, and create the appearance that the ruler cares about everyone. This ploy is especially effective because it exploits a fundamental human desire for participation, fairness, and control over one's own life. Rather than directly suppressing dissent, it simulates participation by getting people to voluntarily or unconsciously support the very system that constrains them. This gives citizens a false sense of control and belonging, which is a powerful stabilizing factor, far more effective than overt coercion. When people feel part of a system, even if it is only an illusion, they are far less likely to disrupt it or rebel against it, even if that system does not always work in their real interests. This trick also allows the authorities to gather valuable information about the mood of society, about potential hotbeds of discontent, without allowing any real changes that could undermine its foundation. The creation of numerous commissions, working groups, interdepartmental committees that study problems for years, hold endless meetings and generate reports, but rarely come to real, meaningful decisions, is also part of this strategy. The process becomes much more important than the result, creating the illusion of vigorous activity, concern for citizens and continuous development, while in reality the system remains unchanged and the authorities grow stronger. One of the most proven, fail-safe, and, unfortunately, often tragic in its consequences, ways to unite a nation around a ruler and distract it from internal problems is the creation of an image of a common enemy. It does not matter whether this enemy is real or completely fictitious. It is important that its image is as convincing as possible, frightening, and causes deep fear or indignation in the overwhelming majority of the population. When society feels a direct and imminent threat from the outside, from other states, or from the inside, from traitors and saboteurs, it instinctively seeks a strong, decisive leader who can protect it. This allows the ruler to consolidate power without hindrance, to justify any, even the most unpopular and harsh measures, be it increasing taxes, introducing draconian laws, restricting civil liberties, unleashing military action or mass repressions, under the pretext of the vital necessity of defending the homeland, fighting a threat, saving the nation, or ensuring security. In ancient times, enemies could be warlike neighboring tribes, foreign invaders, nomadic hordes, or even natural disasters, droughts, floods, earthquakes, which were interpreted as punishment from the gods, requiring immediate strengthening of the power of priests or rulers capable of appeasing the higher powers. Wars with external opponents were often started not so much because of a real existential threat, but in order to distract the population from internal problems such as famine, economic decline, poverty, or growing discontent among the lower classes. A victorious war, even if it was small and had no strategic significance, always strengthened the authority of the ruler, making him a national hero, savior, and symbol of greatness. In more modern times, especially in the 20th century, this trick was brought to perfection and applied with incredible cruelty. Totalitarian regimes constantly needed the existence of an enemy image, both external and internal. This could be world imperialism, the world bourgeoisie, class enemies, spies and saboteurs, secret conspirators, hostile ideologies, terrorists, or even entire nations or ethnic groups that were declared inferior or threatening. Propaganda tirelessly painted terrifying, exaggerated pictures of the coming threat, creating in society an atmosphere of a besieged fortress where everyone had to be vigilant and ready to fight. Any discontent, any criticism, any disagreement within the country was immediately attributed to the machinations of these enemies. If anyone questioned the party's policies, asked uncomfortable questions, or simply showed passivity, they were immediately accused of aiding the enemy, which instantly discredited dissent and served as a convenient justification for mass repressions, purges, and executions. The creation of such an enemy justified the existence of huge security apparatuses, secret services, and mass surveillance. The creation of an enemy image not only incredibly powerfully unites the population around the ruler, but also effectively channels the aggression, discontent, and frustration of the people into a channel that is safe for the authorities. Instead of being outraged by the worsening conditions of their lives, economic injustice, or political lack of rights, people direct their hatred and energy to an external or internal enemy, seeing in it the true source of all their troubles and deprivations. This allows the ruler to constantly act as the only protector, savior, and leader capable of confronting this threat. The authorities may even deliberately provoke minor border conflicts, internal incidents, or terrorist acts, in order to then inflate them to the scale of a national threat, thereby justifying their actions, strengthening control, and demanding even greater loyalty and sacrifices from the population. In some cases, when it is difficult to find a real enemy, they invent one or use as such a small group of the population, which becomes a scapegoat for all problems. This trick works on the most basic and deep human instincts, fear and the desire for security. When people are afraid and feel vulnerable, they are ready to sacrifice a lot, including their civil liberties, material well-being, and even their lives for the sake of imaginary or real protection. The ruler who offers this protection becomes indispensable, his authority grows, and his decisions are perceived as the only correct ones in a crisis. At the same time, the image of the enemy itself can be very vague, abstract, and constantly changing in order to maintain constant tension and prevent society from relaxing. Today it is one threat, tomorrow another. The key is to keep the people feeling threatened and in need of a strong hand to lead them. This allows the ruler to maintain a constant mobilization of the population, directing its energy toward fighting phantoms or minor threats rather than toward understanding the real situation and making demands on the government. This ploy is especially dangerous because it not only strengthens the government but can also lead to real, large-scale conflicts, massive human rights violations, and real tragedies when an imaginary enemy causes real wars, genocide, and persecution, as was the case in many 20th-century dictatorships. The personality cult we discussed earlier is often built on this foundation. A strong, uncontested leader who alone can save the people from a mortal threat. And perhaps one of the most effective, though extremely unobvious and even mundane in nature, tricks is the ruler's complete or partial control over the country's economy and the creation of such a comprehensive system where the vast majority of citizens are directly dependent on the state or the ruling elite for their survival and well-being. When people depend on the government for work, wages, housing, access to food, healthcare, or even the opportunity to get an education for their children, they are unlikely to go against it, fearing to lose everything they have. This is not direct, overt violence, but a very subtle and powerful form of coercion that works through the fear of losing vital benefits. In ancient times, this ploy manifested itself in the monopoly of the most fertile lands, control over the most important water resources, for example in river valleys, where irrigation was key to agriculture, or over the main trade routes. In feudal systems, where peasants were tied to the land and completely dependent on the feudal lord or monarch, this was a classic example. The monarch or landowner controlled not only the land, but also the livelihood of his subjects, as well as their legal status and degree of freedom. Any disobedience could lead to dispossession of the land, hunger, and complete impoverishment. Large religious institutions, temples, monasteries, also played a significant role, controlling vast resources and distributing them among the population, thereby ensuring unconditional loyalty and obedience. In the industrial era, and especially in the 20th century, this mechanism was perfected to incredible proportions. In totalitarian states such as the Soviet Union, China, or the Eastern Bloc, the government became the de facto sole employer. All factories, plants, collective farms, mines, offices, shops, hospitals, and educational institutions belonged to the state. A person could not find a job, get housing, provide himself with medical care, or educate his children if he was disloyal, did not meet ideological requirements, or had the wrong background. The system of distributing all goods, from food stamps and rations to the housing queue, vouchers to sanatoriums and positions, was strictly controlled by the state, which made every citizen extremely dependent on its mercy and on its assessment of loyalty. This total economic dependence created a kind of golden cage. People were provided with basic needs, albeit often at a minimal level, but at the cost of absolute obedience, the renunciation of any freedoms, and a complete lack of real alternatives. The fear of losing a job, being cut off from the housing queue, being expelled from a university for children, or being put on the blacklist was a powerful deterrent, paralyzing the will to resist. Even in countries with nominally market economies or democratic systems, rulers can use this trick, although in a much more veiled and subtle form. This could be control over large state corporations that are the main employers in key sectors of the economy, or the creation of a system of state contracts, subsidies, and grants on which entire sectors of industry or agriculture depend, granting exclusive privileges to loyal businessmen and oligarchs, as well as, conversely, creating artificial barriers and obstacles for those who do not support the government or compete with its protégés, is also part of this strategy. Economic dependence is an invisible but incredibly strong chain that holds society tightly, ensuring the stability of power much more effectively than open coercion, because it does not cause direct resistance, but rather paralyzes the will to it, creating an atmosphere of hopelessness and submission. The creation of a system where career growth, access to scarce goods or services, as well as the ability to run a successful business and receive government orders directly, depend on personal loyalty and connections with the ruling apparatus, completes this system of all-encompassing control. Thus, even those who formerly have some freedom of choice find themselves hostages of their position, preferring compromises and silent agreement for the sake of maintaining their status or simply survival. Thus, we have examined in detail 6 invisible tricks that rulers throughout the history of mankind, which spans tens of thousands of years, have successfully used to maintain and strengthen their power. These strategies, passed down from generation to generation and adapted to changing conditions, include mythologization of one's own image and the creation of the illusion of divinity or infallibility, total control over information flows and the creation of the only true picture of the world, artificial division and pitting of various groups of society against each other, creating in subjects the illusion of participation in governance and control over decisions, forming the image of an external or internal enemy to consolidate the nation, and finally complete or partial control over the economy, leading to the creation of a comprehensive system of citizens' dependence on the state. These methods, often operating covertly and unnoticed, penetrate deeply into the very fabric of society, shaping world views, suppressing critical thinking, neutralizing dissent, and preventing any organized resistance. They work not so much through direct physical violence, although they may be its precursors or accompaniments, but through subtle and sophisticated psychological influence, the manipulation of fundamental human fears, hopes, needs for security, and the desire for survival. They create invisible but strong chains that hold society in submission,